Let me just say a couple things about the exam. We are copies of all previous final exams for this class going back, I don't know, 15 years are available on the course website at my lab. I think the URL is on the syllabus. If not, if you just go to humannaturelab.net and click on teaching, you can go and you can see past illustrative examples of past exams. Last year we did something a bit different than we had done in the past. This year we're going to return to the sort of the strategy we used to deploy. So we're going to give you 2 questions. Each of them is 6 pages that you will answer, and each of the questions will probably have 2 choices. So there'll be some choice on the final. It's obviously a take-home open book exam, and you'll have to basically write 2 6-page essays for the final exam. The questions will be broadly integrative of the entire class. They're not going to be focused on any specific thing. They're going to try to capture some big ideas and topics that sweep the whole semester. We will be grading, as we always do, the exams anonymously. And in order to make it possible for us to do this type of anonymous grading, you have to comply perfectly with the instructions, where you put your ID number and the face sheet and all of this stuff. And Maggie will review some of that stuff with you guys later on, just to make sure. There will be some other complicated mechanics related to the fact that we're online this year and how we distribute the exam and collect it and so on. And we'll also let you know about that. But probably we will post the exam on the course website a week from today. Isn't that right, Maggie? We do it at the end of the day, a week from today?
Yes.
So probably we'll post the exam on the course website a week from today at the end of the day, I don't know, 5 o'clock approximately. And then you'll have approximately a week to complete the assignment. It is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for us to grant extensions because we have to grade all these exams, and then I have to review them all. And then we have to integrate that with all of the other inputs from your grades and submit the grades to the registrar in time for the seniors to graduate and for the other students. So we really can't grant extensions. You know, it's just, I can't think of how we could do that. So you have to finish the exam. You have a whole week to do it. Get started early, plan according to your other demands on your time. I know how much it sucks. I know how much reading period sucks. I know how much exams suck. Believe me, I was a student till I was 33. I understand, but you know, that's the stage of life you're in now. So that's an overview of the exam. Any questions about the exam? The TFs may organize a review session. I don't want to speak for them. Are you planning that? I don't remember if you do that every year.
We don't usually do that for the final.
For the final, okay. Any questions about the final and the mechanics or anything like that? Okay, the last lecture, which is next Thursday, is very important, and I would recommend that you see that live. Okay, let's get started. Any questions for me before I go on? All right, let's see if I can share the screen here. Usual rigmarole. Let's see here. All right. Sound. Yep, I have the sound. Okay. So so last time we did. Oh, one more thing I need to do. There we go. So last time we discussed how the biological can become social, in part by reviewing some findings from behavior genetics, but mostly we focused on how the social can become biological, highlighting how culture can shape the genes we have, or the genetic variants we have across evolutionary time, and also how culture, and specifically our environment, can shape the expression and effect of genes in individuals and in populations. And we discussed how the social environment could modify the expression of our genes through something known as epigenetic control, and how this quasi-permanent, this type of epigenetic effect could be quasi-permanent, and how it might even manifest some kinds of what are known as neo-Lamarckian transmission in this kind of weird fashion that we don't fully understand yet. Now, I want to shift topics a little bit to discuss the next few lectures, kind of another stepping further and further back from what we've been discussing, because I want to talk a little bit about the ways in which culture can shape human experience in another completely different way. And starting with the example of the potential merging of humans and machines, which is alternately described as utopian or dystopian in both fiction and nonfiction. So some of you have read these kinds of things or seen movies of science fiction and so on, with these, Frankenstein, classic novel, these crazy 1950s movies, The Brain That Wouldn't Die. But then there are also examples of people writing about human-machine fusions that are not, from a very personal point of view, that are not science fiction. I mean, this is a man who wrote a book called Rebuilt, How Becoming Part Computer Made Me More Human. It's a book a man wrote about getting a cochlear implant and gave it this rather provocative title. Or here's another book, Born Borg, The Human Species Has Evolved, Adapting to Its Increasingly Technological Environment, now gets set for the next stage of our evolution, flesh meets silicon in Homo Superior. Now, the book Rebuilt was written by Michael Korost, and he had been severely hearing impaired since birth. And one morning in 2001, his remaining hearing suddenly and inexplicably completely shut down. But fortunately for him, this happened at a time when cochlear implants had progressed to the point where people who were formerly isolated from everyday sounds could now, hear leaves rustling as they walked through them, or engage in ordinary speech. And a tiny device was surgically implanted behind his left ear. A little wire threads into the cochlea inside our inner ear, and a magnetic headpiece sticks on the head of the implant, and then with a wire that's connected to a speech processor in his belt. And as Korost describes it, his hearing wasn't restored, it was replaced. His body, in his view, had now become part machine. And the implant was only the first step of the author's learning to hear again, as his brain struggled to interpret the new electrical signals it was receiving. There are other gray zones as well, not between people and machines, but between people and animals. This is baby Faye, and in 1984, she received a baboon heart in a transplant, and she lived for only 20 days after that. This is something known as xenotransplantation, when you take an animal part and you put it in a human body. And in 1992, a pig liver had been implanted in a human to buy time for the human to get a human organ donation, but that patient died in 32 hours. This is Marcus Rehm. He's a 25-year-old German long jumper. He had his right leg amputated below the knee after a boating accident when he was 14. And he emerged as a world-class athlete anyway, winning Germany's national championship in July of 2014. His situation is both inspiring and unusual. He has forced sports officials to consider how to draw the line between able-bodied and disabled athletes. Do prosthetic legs simply level the playing field for Rehm, compensating for his disability, or do they give him an inequitable edge via a kind of techno-doping? It was unclear initially whether sports authorities would allow him to compete. Some have noted that athletes already modify themselves in a number of ways, including baseball sluggers who undergo laser eye surgery to enhance their vision, and pitchers who have elbow reconstruction using sturdier ligaments from elsewhere in their body. And since 2004, for example, transgender athletes with rather substantial body modifications have been allowed to compete in the Olympics. In fact, at least 3 disabled athletes have previously competed in the Summer Olympics. George Iser, an American, won a gold medal in gymnastics while competing on a wooden leg in the 1904 Games in St. Louis. Neroli Fairhall, a paraplegic from New Zealand, competed in archery in the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. And Marla Runyon, a legally blind runner from the United States, competed in the 1,500-meter race in the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. Alas, in Ream's case, a few days after winning his national championship, the governing body for German track and field announced that it would not nominate Ream to its roster for the European Championships, an honor that it was historically all but guaranteed to the national champion. Now, these types of bodily modifications erase the lines between abled and disabled, raising also philosophical questions. What should an athlete look like? Where should limits be placed on technology to balance fair play with a right to compete? Around the same time as the previous examples, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, also took a stab at defining which athletes count as women. Specifically, an initial ruling excluded females with a male range of androgen levels from competing. But interestingly, the IOC has given male range females an out. They may opt to medically lower their androgen levels. Some athletes took the IOC up on their offer. Caster Semenya, a South African track star, has been receiving some sort of treatment in order to run, in London. So here she is on the left before this treatment and on the right. Quote, either due to criticism or because of the new regulations or some other factors, Semenya no longer qualifies as breathtakingly butch, according to the Toronto Star's Stephanie Findlay, who now describes her as feminine. Quote, she wears a tight turquoise polo over her fit feminine body, relaxed, poised, and it must be said, pretty. The young woman with an irresistible smile is almost unrecognizable from photographs taken during the height of the controversy, this Toronto Star reporter wrote. And indeed, if you can look at these photos, Semenya's face got rounder, her hair got longer, and her figure curvier, as you can see. Whether fair or unfair, there may be something to the advantage line of this argument. Semenya's performance times also look rather different after her estrogen treatment. She won a 2009 race with a 1 hour, 55 minute and 45 seconds time by a 2-second margin. And subsequent to treatment, alas, she placed 8th in a race with a slower time of over 2 hours. In 2017, the International Association of Athletics Federations commissioned research to evaluate the role of naturally occurring testosterone in female athletes' bodies and determined that, unsurprisingly, that testosterone was helpful. In elite sports, even tiny advantages can make a huge difference. But if we buy into the IOC's logic, why not go whole hog? Let's test all male athletes and bar as unfairly advantaged those with abnormally high end of the androgen spectrum too. And what are we to do with male to female transgender athletes, including some who have not had sex reassignment surgery, whose competition as women could entirely upend league tables of performance? In 2016, at least 2 male to female transsexuals were slated to compete in women's events in the Olympics. Or consider Duty Chand. She loves her body just the way it is. As a young teenager, she was dismayed by that her body lacked curves, but now at 18, she had no problem with it. Yet in the summer of 2014, Chand, who was India's 100-meter champion in the 18 and under category, was barred from competing against women. She has a condition called hyperandrogenism, and her body produces natural levels of testosterone so high that they place her in the male range in the eyes of international track and field commissions. Following a rule by the International Association of Athletics Federations, track's governing body, the Athletics Federation of India will allow Chand to return to competition only if she lowers her testosterone level beneath the male range. She can do that by either taking hormone-suppressing drugs or having surgery to limit how much testosterone her body produces. What was her response? No way. I feel like it's wrong to have to change your body for sports participation, she said. I'm not changing for anyone. Chand and Semenya's cases are potentially more troubling than that of Ream's case because they are competing with a body they were born with, a purity the IAAF rule says is not allowed in her case. Aside from hormone-suppressing drugs or an operation, her alternative is just to give up professional athletics. What about this? Who knows what these things are? Raise your hands if you know what these swimsuits are. Okay, what about this? How is this different if you wear a swimsuit like this? Any thoughts? Kate?
Yeah, I'm a swimmer, so I'm really familiar with these. These swimsuits, the gray panels are basically like a buoyancy material where you literally like float. And like when these suits were rolled out, like people went like record-breaking times, like so much faster than if you like didn't have the buoyancy material. And there was like controversy for a while because Michael Phelps like rejected this and was like, I can beat you all without the suit. But it was like really hard to do and very, very controversial. And then they eventually got rid of them.
Yes. So I'm sorry, they got rid of them or they allowed them? I can't remember the outcome, Kate. Do you remember?
They allowed them for like a year or two. There was like one Olympics with it where all the records were broken, and then
Yes.
they took them away. And it's like notoriously very hard to break these records now.
Thank you. I didn't know that final part of the story because I can't track all these stories. They change, they evolve from year to year. So I knew that they had allowed them, but not that then they had reversed their decision. That's exactly right. These are researchers, thank you, Kate. These are researchers from Speedo's Aqualab, its global research and development facility, approached NASA's Langley Research Center to conduct research on drag reduction of swimsuits because of the center's long history of wind tunnel testing on drag reduction for aircraft and boats. And Aqualab worked with NASA aerospace engineer Steve Wilkinson and other US and foreign research organizations, as well as US Olympic swimmers, to develop this laser LZR racer swimsuit. But then, as Kate just summarized, in 2008, an astonishing 108 world records in swimming were broken, 79 of them by swimmers wearing this suit. And opponents called the use of such swimsuits technological doping. Now, against this backdrop of these challenging cases that I put before you, let's consider the issue of human enhancement, its morality, and its regulation. And there are difficult questions here related to the application of technology to human enhancements in areas as diverse as curing disabilities, health, longevity, intelligence, emotional control, aesthetic expression, spiritual goals, or ensuring the best lives for one's children. I mean, why would anyone oppose such enhancements? Would it be better to live shorter lives, have more disabilities, have less intelligence or less memory or less happiness? What's the difference between a cochlear implant and a bionic ear that we could buy and just make our hearing better? What's the distinction between cosmetic surgery, which we willy-nilly allow, and genetic enhancement? And in your readings, you had a lot of troubling contrasts. For example, controlling diabetes with diet versus an internal insulin pump, or looking at SAT score improvement with Kaplan test prep versus Ritalin. Many of you had test prep in order to come to Yale. Some of you may have had methylphenidate or Ritalin or other such prescriptions. Is there a difference between those two? Or weight loss via exercise versus plastic surgery or drugs? Why do you care or feel differently about whether I lose weight by exercising or I just go to a doctor and have him suck out some fat with a little device and then I'm better all of a sudden, let's say? Or other examples were in your readings. For example, musicians who use beta blockers, it's a kind of heart medication that lowers your heart rate, to conquer stage fright. Or the Supreme Court case of a golfer who needed a cart. Was the ability to walk on the golf course the essential aspect of the sport? Or what about corrective myopia surgery? Why would we allow athletes, for example, to improve their vision, but draw the line at some other part of their body if we say people have to compete with the bodies that they were born with? Sandel provides the illustration in your readings of oxygen deprivation during runners' training. As some of you may know, I don't know, maybe some of you, I'm sure, some of you are probably long distance runners. Many long distance runners train at very high altitudes where the oxygen pressure is lower, because then when they come to sea level, they feel like incredibly strong. I used to do karate for many, many years, and our sensei used to equip us with weights on our hands and feet. And we would train with these weights and fight with these weights, and then he would take the weights off, and we felt like we were flying. If we allow the runners to go to high altitudes to stress their bodies in that way, how is that different from deliberately depriving themselves of oxygen in tents? If they build a tent to lower their oxygen level and sleep in such a tent as Sandel describes at sea level, which seems creepy, somehow it seems more natural to just go to a high altitude, but we allow them to do that, which then their body then pumps up more hemoglobin, which makes them better able to, let's say, compete in running, versus allowing them to inject themselves with erythropoietin, which is a drug that has the same effect of juicing their hemoglobin level. Or finally, having erythropoietin genes added to their genotype. They could maybe have some kind of genetic modification. All of these are on some kind of a spectrum. What's the difference between these things, we might ask ourselves? Harris, in the readings, considers a conceit of a school which achieves superhuman outcomes versus technology which does. What would be the difference between a school where young athletes or people seeking other superhuman abilities could go to acquire them versus some kind of technological implant? And Harris and Sandel are arguing about this very deep and fundamental idea. Sandel's opening gambit of whether it is wrong to make a deaf child by design and whether it is wrong to take a tall or to make a tall or smart child by design. What's the difference? There are many cases of deaf parents who say, I want to do embryo selection to make sure my child is deaf and abort the non-deaf child. How is that different than the opposite decision-making by hearing parents, for instance? These are not easy questions, as you can see. Furthermore, you can imagine that technologies that engage in life extension could be just very common sense expansions of technologies that are engaged in life saving. All of us would be interested in investing in the discovery of technologies that save lives, but once we do that, maybe those same technologies could extend lives. We typically better ourselves by bettering our environment. But what about literally improving ourselves? What about deliberately intervening in the natural lottery and not just the social lottery as we've been discussing so far in this class? After all, changes we've been implementing in our culture have been modifying our genes anyway, as we saw last time. In other words, we're already modifying our genes, by domesticating animals and inventing glasses and all of that stuff I discussed last time. What about kind of doing that very deliberately, maybe on an individual level? What's the difference between all of these? Well, let's take a look at the effects of these technologies. Here are some technologies that affect the human brain. Let me just see here. And you can imagine the brain enhancers in a kind of 2x2 matrix, hardware and software, and internal versus external kinds of technology. So these are external hardware enhancers. In the olden days, we invented pictures and writing, right? Writing is an external brain enhancer. We didn't always have writing. We didn't evolve to be a writing animal. We invented writing, and it's very helpful to us. And now we can have, wearable computers or cell phones, for example. So you guys probably don't remember this, but this is sort of a Google Glass, like a little camera that you could have will give you like internet hookup through your eyes as you're walking around. But eventually we might have a kind of wireless exocerebrum that, which I'll come to in just a moment. Or you could, okay, here's the Google Glass example. I mean, the Google Glass example was, it has a little camera mounted on your glass, and it can use facial recognition software and other kinds of technology, for example, know where you are. And so as you approach someone, it might recognize their face, see who they are, pull up their Wikipedia page, and put a little screenshot in front of you. This is Nicholas Christakis. He is a professor at Yale University. And so you could like suddenly get information, which would be very useful to someone like me who has a lot of trouble with names. I would love to have a technology like that. Every time I approached one of you, it would say, this is Jennifer Yoon, or this is Alex Kane, for example, you know, or Danielle Ricketts. And I was like, oh, that's great. Now I know who that person is. Or as you approach this subway stop, it would say, you know what? Don't go down these steps. Subway service is suspended. Or it could show you like maps and so on. Literally, this would be unbelievable. And if we had this, and this technology was tried for a while and then abandoned for reasons I don't know, maybe some of you know, but you can imagine eventually this would be in a lens implanted in our eye, right? Just like we do cataract surgery and replace people's lenses, you know, we could make this inside your eye. So no one would even know that you were having this little like Terminator-like, you know, screen that you could see. Or these are external software. Many of you use these all the time. You know, we invented calendars, but there's internet and search, data visualization, or expert systems or biofeedback, all kinds of external software we use. Or internal software, like better thinking, right? Getting an education, the kind of human capital investment, is like upgrading your internal software. When you come to Yale, you are ostensibly taught how to think better. So education, or mnemonics, you know, like aids for memory, or cognitive therapy, or meditation and concentration. Meditation is a miraculous discovery and really changes how you are in the world. Or internal hardware, like drugs, or gene therapy, or deep brain stimulation, or certain ideas about stem cell use, or sensory prosthetics, or brain-computer interfaces. Now let's spend a moment on a couple of these. We already saw a sensory prosthetic in the case of a cochlear implant, but what about more than that? Let me see if I can, if you can hear this. I hope you can hear this. Maggie, let me know if you can't hear the sound, okay?
Once in a while, we run across a science story that is hard to believe until you see it. That's how we felt about this story when we first saw human beings operating computers, writing emails, and driving wheelchairs with nothing but their thoughts. Quietly, in a number of laboratories, an astounding technology is developing that directly connects the human brain to a computer. It's like a sudden leap in human evolution, a leap that could one day help paralyzed people to walk again and amputees to move bionic limbs. As we first reported last November, the connection has already been made for a few people, and for them, it has been life-changing. Scott Mackler was a husband, father, and successful neuroscientist when he received perhaps the worst news imaginable. At the age of 40, he could run a marathon in 3.5 hours, but it was about that time that he discovered he had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. His brain was losing its connection to virtually every muscle in his body. The near total paralysis would also stop his lungs. He didn't want to live on a ventilator, so 9 years ago, he recorded this message for his 2 sons.
I know the future holds lots of love and joy and pride, and that life goes on, and I'll be watching you along the way. And I love you very much, and I'll see you.
This is Scott Mackler today. His mind is sharp as ever, but his body has failed. Doctors call it locked-in syndrome. Scott and his wife, Lynn, learned to communicate with about the only thing he has left, eye movement.
He'll look at you for yes.
Right.
And for no.
And for no, he looks away.
Yeah.
I see. It's cumbersome.
It is.
But recently, Scott found a new voice.
Can everyone hear the PC? I apologize for the quality of the voice.
Scott wrote these words one letter at a time with nothing but his thoughts and the help of what's called a brain-computer interface, or BCI. He wears a cap that picks up the electrical activity of his brain and allows him to select letters simply by thinking about them. Then the computer turns his sentences into speech.
I hate being helpless, and when other people put words in my mouth.
Well, this is a very unusual interview for 60 Minutes. We've done something that we never, ever do, and that is we've submitted the questions in advance because it takes Scott a little while to put the answers together using the BCI device. Scott, I understand that earlier in the progression of this disease, you said that at the point you had to go on a ventilator, you didn't want to go on anymore. But today you are on a ventilator, and I'm curious about what changed your mind.
Because I can still communicate.
It isn't fast. It takes.
I actually knew this man when I did my training at the University of Pennsylvania. And it's incredible to see this technology. Now, we could imagine other such devices being implanted within our body to do all kinds of, perform all kinds of functions. And the technology has advanced dramatically, even since this 60-minute episode. And I'd like to show you the huge progress that's been made, because we now have technology that can translate neural activity into speech, which would be transformative for people who are unable to communicate as a result of neurological impairments. Decoding speech from neural activity is challenging because speaking requires very precise and rapid multidimensional control of vocal tract articulators. And these scientists designed a neural decoder that explicitly leverages kinematic and sound representations encoded in human cortical activity to synthesize audible speech. And these findings advance the clinical viability of using speech neuroprosthetic technology to restore spoken communication. So the idea is we're going to put a little grid of electrodes on your brain. You're going to think about what you want to say, and the descending neurons will go to activate the muscles. You'll use the appropriate parts of your brain to activate the analogous muscles that you're supposed to use. These electrodes will detect this neural activity, interpret how you're moving your vocal cords, and then listen to the waveform and the acoustics in people who can actually speak, and then synthesize this using statistical procedures to decode the speech that you would have said, that your larynx would have said, based on the electrical signals from your mind. And this paper was just published in Nature, Speech Synthesis from Neural Decoding of Spoken Sentences 2 years ago. Let me show this to you because it's mind-boggling.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Do you see that? I'll show you another example in a minute, but it showed the neural activity. It showed how the tongue and the larynx and everything was going to be moving in the middle panel on the left, and then what would have been said, and then provided the shipbuilding is the most fascinating process, which is pretty good, actually. Here's another example.
Bright sunshine shimmers on the ocean.
Bright sunshine shimmers on the ocean.
Bright sunshine shimmers on the ocean. Addition and subtraction are learned skills.
Addition and subtraction are learned skills.
And you can see here, they're looking at the lips and the tongue and the motion of that in order to see what you might be saying, and then interpolating based on standards. It's just unbelievable. Well, is what we've been talking about a utopian or dystopian vision of the future? Here's some slides of this that summarize part of what some people foresee. Commercial entities that provide modifications of our genes and bodies, such as this fictitious company, Human Upgrade, might emerge. Human Upgrade, products, surgeries, and so on. Here's an ad you can imagine for such a company. To lose, yes, I remember, that was before. To win, that is what forces humans to go to the edge. There is no better feeling than to conquer your enemies, to be the best, to be the master. Be what evolution did not let you be, and make the step which leads further than ever before. For those for whom the thrones were made is this imaginary ad campaign. This technology contains an element of comparison. One upgrades to improve one's relative standing. This is an idea we discussed in the class a long time ago, this notion of relative standing. One upgrades to improve one's idea of relative standing, which is one of Sandel's objections, and one of sociologist and transhumanist philosopher J. Hughes, who, if you're interested in this topic, you should read his book, Citizen Cyborg, which is one of Sandel's concerns and one of J. Hughes's concerns is, what if only the rich can upgrade? So one of the objections to this idea is that, well, might it contribute to inequality? Or here's this idea, a sixth finger. I used to stick fight when I was your age at Yale, and I loved it. And I can tell you, having a sixth finger would have been really helpful for using nunchucks or using a bow staff to fight. See this sixth finger here? That is a very effective way to hold this weapon. Or picking up on Kate's swimming desire, I don't know if Kate would be interested in this, you could have webbed fingers. I'm sure Kate would tell you that it would be really helpful to swimming if you had webbed fingers, even though it's kind of gross in other regards. Or what if you just don't like having to brush your teeth? You could get simple tooth, which is just a single tooth going all the way around. Or maybe a simple nose, for example. Would we allow people to do this to themselves, or to their children, or to our society? Why do these images regarding human upgrade feel different than the prior taxonomy that I introduced earlier on some of the tools, to enhance our bodies and our minds, or than the problem or the images of Riem, the German runner? Should they feel different? Should we think differently about these cases than about the cochlear implant or the prosthetic leg or the erythropoietin modifications in order to be a better runner? Or what about this case that was in the news a couple of years ago? Here, the scientists assessed the use of engineered vaginal organs in 4 patients between the ages of 13 and 18 who had vaginal aplasia. That means they were born with no vaginas, caused by a disease called Meyer-Rokitansky-Kuster-Hauser syndrome. And what they did in this case is they took a vulvar biopsy of these young girls' vulva, and they took that autologous tissue from each patient, and then they cultured it in the laboratory and expanded it, and they seeded epithelial and muscle cells onto biodegradable scaffolds, like a little tube, for example. And they put these cells that were from the woman's body, the girl's body, onto the scaffold and kind of grew or constructed an artificial vagina. These organs were constructed and allowed to mature in an incubator, and then they were surgically implanted within these patients who were followed for 8 years. Yearly biopsy showed a tri-layered structure consisting of epithelial cell-lined lumen, that's the hole, surrounded by a matrix and muscle with expected components of vaginal tissue present. And MRIs demonstrated that the engineered organs were functional, and there were no abnormalities after the surgery, which was also confirmed by a pelvic exam. And finally, they administered a validated self-administered female sexual function index, which found that all the indicators were in the normal range: desire, arousal, lubrication, orgasm, satisfaction, and painless intercourse. How would this be different from using the same technology to make for a woman an extracorporeal uterus? Oh, you don't want to carry the baby to term? You don't have to. We'll build an incubator based on your own cells to make another uterus of your own body in which we will implant your baby so it can grow in the laboratory. What's the difference between these situations? They're not easy questions. Or some of these kinds of changes could even occur naturally. In January of 2009, baby Kamani Hubbard was born in Daly City, California, with 6 fully formed and functional fingers and toes on his hands and feet. This condition is known as polydactyly. So you can look carefully here. You see his little perfect little hands in this little baby? He has 6 fingers. And here's an X-ray of his hand. He has 6 fingers. This condition is called polydactyly, and it's not uncommon, but this case is remarkable because it's exceedingly rare to have all 6 intact. Usually there's just a little stub, like right here's my hand, there'd be like a little extra stub here, for example. His dad, Chris Hubbard, a 34-year-old postal worker, noticed this spectacularly rare case of polydactyly at birth. 6 perfect fingers on each hand and 6 perfect fingers on each foot, which went well beyond a general trait that ran in his family. Some family members had had 6 fingers, not completely developed, but not the toes. And in fact, Chris Hubbard himself, the father, had nubs of his 6 fingers removed as a child, as such non-functional digits are. But what if the digits are functional? Imagine what kind of a piano player, let alone stick fighter, baby Kamani might become. What would you do if you were his parent? Would you remove a functioning extra finger? Or would you say this is the body he was born naturally with? And how is this different than administering estrogen to Castor Semenya that we discussed at the beginning to make her more feminine? Not easy to answer these questions. And there's actually hold on a second, because I've lost my, it's so hard to find. 1 second here, I need to move this over. There's actually a social and intellectual movement in favor of embracing these technologies, and it's called transhumanism. As I said, it's an intellectual and cultural movement and a set of ideas that affirms the possibility and desirability of transcending the limitations of the human body through applied reason, especially by using technology to eliminate aging and enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. Transhumanists see themselves as humanists who emphasize what we have the potential to become through reason. Yet all of these technologies, as Jay Hughes argues in Citizen Cyborg, raise important political questions. Like, do we want to allow some people to make these changes in ways that affect the broader society? Are we concerned about inequality in the application of these technologies? How can we prohibit people from improving their own bodies? If they want to improve their own children through education, we'll allow that. But if they want to improve their own children through genetic engineering, we might not. On what basis would we make this distinction? So Hughes argues that actually these debates are best resolved through a democratic process. And he furthermore argues that that the existence of these technologies might lead to all kinds of crazy new political coalitions where people for completely like this disabled rights community and the green community, or right-wing people that have strongly theological ideas and left-wing people who are concerned about inequality. There could be strange political coalitions that are scrambled or emerge because of a consistency of vision about these kinds of challenges. And the movement is partly based on the argument that human traits have no clear beginning, evolutionarily speaking, and therefore may have no clear end. In fact, over the last 20 years, when I was at Yale, we were still being told that, only humans made tools, and then Jane Goodall finds chimpanzees, who make tools. So no, that's not that. Only humans do this, only humans do that. Every time that's said, that sentence is rejected. Apes exhibit almost all the alleged capacities of human nature: self-awareness, language, morality, empathy, or tool use, for example. It's really hard to draw the boundary of where these things begin. And in fact, the emergence of new technologies has always and will always raise problems by blurring boundaries between deeply felt cultural categories like these, between animals and humans, between men and women, which is a big debate right now in our society, between humans and machines, between the living and the dead, between natural and artificial. Oh, here it is, between women and men, and between the young and the old. These are kind of Hegelian dichotomies, that we kind of, we tend to dichotomize the world and draw boundaries between these things. And the technology kind of blurs the boundaries. And that's one of the reasons it stirs us up and it's so difficult for us. When the boundaries between animals and humans or humans and machines or the living and the dead are blurred, we don't like it. It's difficult. It's hard for us to figure out the morality and the policy of such divisions. But this technology has the prospect for substantially affecting our bodies, our health, and our society. And whether we want to embrace the technology or not, given its inevitability, we need to have ways to decide. And in fact, you could ask yourself, going back almost to the first or second lecture of this class, whether we are going to have a fifth phase of the health transition. I mentioned this at the very beginning of the class, but it's unclear. Remember, we talked about how life expectancy had plateaued? Well, what if we're about to enter, 1,000 years from now, they'll look back and they say, yeah, the 21st century, was the next step up. They stopped reproducing because they became immortal. They just could live forever and expand their life horizon. What if this kind of technology, what if we're on the cusp of a totally new way of being, which could fit in with a pattern that we discussed before? Let me pause there to see if there are any questions, and then I have some final ideas to finish up with. Who thinks these questions are easy? Yeah, they're not easy. Any questions or thoughts? Should I ask Kate if she wants webbed fingers? Put her on the spot. Would you do it or no?
No, definitely not.
Definitely not. Yeah. You could be a world champion if you had webbed fingers. You still wouldn't be worth it.
I don't think that would be enough.
Not enough. Other thoughts? Nothing from you guys today? All right. Let me show you a few final ideas. Some of these lectures I'm giving you are going faster than they usually go. And the reason is that I don't have the capacity to engage you. I can't see you, as you guys know, which is really frustrating for me. And you guys lapse into your pleasant anonymity of Zoom, which you shouldn't do. You should participate and weigh in, especially when I ask you to, because it's nice, it's kind. Anyway, let me close with a few ideas. So here's the argument. This is the contours of the argument as expressed by Sandel and Harris. And so the question is, if the goal is okay, do the means justify it? And as many of you have probably learned, if you've taken other classes in philosophy or ethics, in essence, Sandel is a deontologist and Harris is a utilitarian. And deontology is the idea that the moral worth of an action depends on the rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, and not on the rightness or wrongness of the consequences of those actions. It privileges the duty or obligation inherent in certain courses of action. So deontology says the means don't justify the ends. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, is the idea that the moral worth of an action is solely determined by its contribution to overall utility in maximizing happiness or pleasure as summed among all persons. It is a form of consequentialism. The moral worth of an action is determined by its outcome, and the ends justify the means. This is what Sandel and Harris are essentially arguing about. And Sandel, and you should do the reading if you haven't, Sandel's major objection is that genetic enhancements represent a triumph of will over giftedness. He seems to prefer fate over choice. And he seems to think there's something intrinsically moral about what is natural. But we've already learned that that's kind of a weak idea. Death during childbirth is natural. There's nothing moral about that, as we discussed months ago. We would willingly stop women from dying while delivering babies, even if it's a wholly natural thing. Sandel, as summarized by Harris, suggests that designed children are somehow less than fully free, though he acknowledges limitations to his argument. And he raises the specter of eugenics to argue against genetic engineering without adequately exploring the similarities and differences between eugenics and genetic engineering. Harris doesn't just reject Sandel's argument. He doesn't just say, well, no, it's morally okay to engage in genetic modifications. Harris says it's a moral obligation to engage in genetic modifications. He says there is a positive moral duty to enhance. And he is entirely okay with this idea of ceasing to be human as we understand the term. He says that's fine. We'll evolve into some kind of transhumanist future. And in essence, his argument is a greater good argument. Now, sometimes when this argument is made, it goes like this. Someone says, on the one side, people say, well, what if only the rich can make their children brilliant? That would be awful because it would contribute to inequality. Does anyone know a counter argument to that? A greater good counter argument to that? Can anyone think of that? Did we all benefit from the fact that Mozart and Einstein were born the way they were? Yes, we did. We are tremendous beneficiaries of the giftedness of those individuals. So the argument goes, wouldn't it be amazing if we could create more of them artificially? I would benefit if you had your children be Einstein. So the argument, the counter argument that's made against the inequality objection is that no, we are all made better off. This is actually a classic debate between Nozick and Rawls. Rawls's theory of justice and Nozick's anarchy, state, and utopia. In essence, Nozick argues, Wilt Chamberlain, this is a famous example. Wilt Chamberlain was a famous basketball player. You guys probably haven't heard of him. But anyway, he's like Magic Johnson or Scottie Pippen, or I don't know who the most famous basketball players are right now. But anyway, who can tell me a famous basketball player? Does anyone in this class know a very famous basketball player? Yes, Severin.
Giannis Antetokounmpo and Luka Doncic right now.
Yeah, it's a good Greek guy. That's right. So he's a famous basketball player. What Nozick argues is we are all better off when he is born and can play basketball, and we willingly surrender some of our money to watch him play and give it to him, just because he was born this way. Why wouldn't we therefore be better off? People who criticize the inequality argument say, if we allowed some parents to genetically engineer their children. I'm not taking a stand on this, understand. I'm just saying it's not easy, in my view, to decide these matters. So these are the key questions. What is the difference between using technologies to cure disease or acquire superhuman powers? In fact, I'm going to ask you these questions because you're pissing me off a little bit that you're not engaging. So I'm going to ask you these questions. What's the difference between using these technologies to cure disease or to acquire superhuman powers? Does anyone here have any ideas as to the difference? This is not a trick question. It's a matter of opinion. Yes, Ayman.
I'd say curing diseases is more like a reactive thing. You know what the end result is going to be, but giving superhuman powers is a more proactive thing. You're not sure what the person with the superhuman powers are going to end up doing. Like you said, they might be a genius. They might end up contributing to society, but with their gifts, they might end up being a detriment to society.
Good. That's a good argument about the difference between two. Other ideas. A couple of you raised your hands. David.
Less on the good or bad, but just like a way to differentiate them. I feel like it has to do with the average. And so it's like if we have like average human, like it's like going from here to here versus here to here.
So you think, for example, if someone who can't hear, it's okay because they're below average hearing to get a cochlear implant, but someone like me, who can hear, I shouldn't be able to get a bionic ear that gives me superhuman hearing.
Yes, because it's not because being able to hear is not a superhuman power. Unless you would argue that like not being able to hear is a natural thing that happens to people, which is true. And so being able to hear while being born not able to hear would be superhuman. I get that. But if we don't make that full
No, but I'm saying you could implant a technology in me that would make me able to hear a whisper, 100.
And then that I would say that's superhuman. And so that's
what I'm talking about. So
yeah,
because above average. Okay. So so you would say in fact you're almost going back to the normality definition of health that we had, the statistical definition that we had at the beginning of the class. You're saying if you're below, then you can have the technology to get up to the average, but if you're above the average, no, you're stuck. You can't improve it. Am I allowed to use binoculars or no?
Yes, you are allowed to use binoculars, but you're not allowed. But you're allowed to use binoculars at like the beach, but you're not allowed to use binoculars at like the Olympic bird watching like event.
So now it's situation specific.
Yeah,
What if I tape the binoculars to my head and I'm just walking around all the time with these binoculars? Would that be allowed or no? You would make me take them off when I go to the Olympics, the bird watching.
Yeah, because it's like you can like do whatever you want to like yourself in your house, but like when the time, like I don't think it should be a procedure that hospitals do, and I don't think.
No, you're adding all kinds of other.
Okay, yeah.
Or do it to myself, let's say. So would you let Reem with his artificial leg compete or not compete? By your argument, he shouldn't be allowed to compete, or he's in the below average category. But I could argue that he's already a better runner than I was. In other words, it's not fair that he was born such a good runner. Did any of you read that? I forgot, it's a science fiction thing that's often assigned in middle school about sameness, where everyone is forced to be the same. Does anyone know this reference? No one read this book in middle school? A book where like everyone was obliged to be the same? Some kind of creepy, all right.
Are they like gray blobs or something?
I can't remember what the title of the book is, unfortunately. Okay.
The Giver?
What?
The Giver?
The Giver. I think it was The Giver. Yes, that's right. Thank you. Okay, so what's the difference between using technologies to cure disease versus acquire superhuman powers? Anyone else have any thoughts on this topic? Severin, you're all free to speak up. Please do.
I was more concerned about certain psychosocial elements, and like one of the things that immediately brought to mind was when you mentioned external uterus. I'm just wondering, because there's a lot of like research into how, like what happens to the fetus while like inside a mother, like they can respond to like sound and can respond to specifically like the mother's heartbeat or the mother's voice and like stuff like that. And I feel like having an external portion there like just definitely goes away to a lot of things. And I'm not sure whether or not this person would have like the same, I don't know, like the same gifts that a person who's born like naturally or whatever would have.
But I could respond with a technical fix to that. I'll say, we're going to eventually, if we can create an extra corporeal uterus, we can figure out these more simple problems. You will record the mother's voice or synthesize it and beam it into this little uterus, that's outside her body. But many of you are emphasizing the social implications of these technologies. You're saying, making the argument, it's not just about what you do to your body. What you do to your body affects the bodies of others. Okay, here is the next question. Oh, yes, Mariah.
Oh, yeah, sorry to interrupt. Maybe just to play devil's advocate a little bit.
Good.
I could see a situation where maybe there's not as clear of a distinction between like acquiring superhuman powers and like curing diseases, depending on which definition of disease we use. Like, say if we use maybe the social definition of disease and like people who, I don't know, maybe in a society in the future, people who aren't born with like super perfect noses, whatever that would be considered disease, then they would get like cosmetic surgery to like enhance that in some way that could almost be considered superhuman. Like then that's kind of fitting both those categories at once.
Yeah, so you're also emphasizing in your question the social contingency, right? Like what counts as good hearing or a good nose or good running speed, or frankly, even what's considered athletic is sort of arbitrary. And so maybe depending on which definition of healthiness we adopt, it kind of muddies the waters in this question. And I agree with you. Here's the second question. Why is self-modification through self-control different from self-modification through technology? Why do we think, okay, if you do Stanley Kaplan for your SAT prep, that's okay, but if there's like a little pill you pop and you get terrific performance, so we don't like that. What's the difference between those? It's not a trick question. What's the difference between those? Yeah, Ananya.
Well, I guess in the case of you like practicing with Kaplan, you're still putting in the effort to like make yourself better. But if you were taking a pill, like I would argue that you're not really putting in effort. Like the pill is doing the work and making you better. So
we think there's some virtue in the effort, right? But all of us would happily accept or buy a technology which simplifies our lives, right? Like all of labor-saving technology, all of the machines we've invented for the last 200 years are designed to reduce our effort, right? Make our lives easier. I mean, I don't disagree with Ananya. That's exactly the difference. But the question then becomes, well, why do we think effort is so virtuous, right? I mean, what is it about our moral system that thinks, oh, it's struggle is valuable, morally praiseworthy, not just like the ancient Greeks said, pathemathos, through suffering comes knowledge. Actually, there's a lot of truth to that, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're saying like there's moral virtues, not just that you learn through effort, which we could defend, but we're saying you're morally superior because you made the effort. If you make that argument, why do we go and watch these amazing athletes at all? Like part of why they're amazing, of course, is that they've made a tremendous amount of training, but a lot of it is just genetics. They were just born better than you and me, right? And so I should assign moral worth to some whoever that basketball player was a moment ago? No, he was just born that way, and I'm just going to pay him some money to watch him. Okay, here's another thing. Why should things that lie between be morally problematic at all? Like why when I put that dichotomy of living and dead and natural and artificial and human and machine, and I said, oh, there's these things are contested. Okay, they can be contested, but why do they seem to evoke moral distinctions? This is a very difficult question. Why intrinsically these kinds of distinctions invite in us considerations of morality? And finally, on the slide, let me see where I'm at here now. And finally on the slide was the question, well, let me put them up now in case you guys want them. Hold on. And finally on the slide is the question, do technology and democracy go together, and why should they? And this picks up on some of the ideas I mentioned a moment ago about the democratic versus non-democratic exercise of technological power. This is going to be a question that'll be prominent in your lives during this century, in part because of, I think, the competition, the nation-state competition that'll be taking place between democracies, democratic and non-democratic societies, in an era in which technology offers so much power of governments to control their people. Americans, of course, like many of you manifested, have an aversion to reward without merit, to effortless reward. And Sandel argues natural gifts and the admiration they inspire embarrass the meritocratic faith. They cast doubt on the conviction that praise or rewards flow from effort alone. Still, Sandel admires natural gifts because they are natural and because they somehow have some kind of intrinsic dignity. Sandel almost has a religious argument, in fact, almost, that these are some kind of natural, God-given way that we were made. Democracy, J. Hughes argues in Citizen Cyborg, as I mentioned, is needed to control these technologies. And in fact, in some ways, democracy and science and technology together have been the principal sources of the rise in human welfare over the last 200 years, and maybe for the coming 200 as well. As you may or may not be aware, in fact, you are aware because I taught this to you earlier in the course, when we looked at the rise in human longevity, we saw that there was an inflection that began in Europe about 200 years ago with the Enlightenment, when lifespans skyrocketed, partly as a result of the philosophical changes and advances during the Enlightenment, but also partly as a result of the technological innovation. I understand, of course, that Enlightenment principles weren't uniformly applied to all people, but that's not my point right now. My point is that these philosophical commitments to equality, to democracy, to reason, and the ability of reason to enhance human welfare, coupled with the scientific advances in physics and chemistry and biology, which gave us the steam engine and modern sanitation and modern medicine and all of this stuff, have substantially improved human life. That in a sense, this technology and these political beliefs have gone side by side and have tremendously advanced human welfare in the last 200 years. And maybe, as I'm suggesting, for the next 400 as well, such that we might, in fact, enter a kind of fifth stage of the health transition. Okay, that's what I have for you today. Any questions? All right, thank you guys. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.